Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This phrase, written by Lord Acton, has become almost an unquestioned truth, repeated so often that no one stops to examine it anymore. But here's the problem. Ideas that sound simple are often hiding something far more complex. Does power really turn good people into bad ones? Or does it simply reveal what was already there? Today, on Logos and Law, we go beyond the cliché. Through the lens of Friedrich Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt, and Aristotle, we're going to explore what power actually does to the human mind and why this question is far more dangerous than it seems. Because the real issue may not be power itself, but who we become when we have it.
To begin, we need to understand what it means to corrupt. The word comes from the Latin corrumpere, to break, to deteriorate, to destroy something that was once whole. When we say power corrupts, we are saying that it takes something that was intact and undoes that integrity, that it turns honest people dishonest, that it bends principles that once seemed unshakable, that it makes someone who swore to serve begin instead to serve themselves. This happens. It is undeniable. History is full of examples. Leaders who began with genuine ideals and ended up surrounded by privilege, impunity, and an impressive capacity to justify anything they did. But the more interesting philosophical question is not to observe that this happens. It is to ask what exactly power does to the human mind to make this happen so consistently.
Nietzsche had an answer. For him, the desire for power, the will to power, is not a corruption of human nature. It is its most fundamental expression. Every living being, Nietzsche argued, wants to expand, to grow, to overcome resistance, to affirm its existence. The problem is not wanting power. The problem is what we do with it once we have conquered it, and whether we have the inner strength to bear it without losing ourselves inside it. For Nietzsche, power does not corrupt the strong. It reveals the weak. Whoever becomes corrupt in power was never truly whole to begin with. They simply had not yet been tested. Power does not create a person's character. It exposes it. It is a disturbing idea because it inverts the comfortable narrative. It was not power that turned that leader into a tyrant. The tyrant was already there, waiting for the opportunity. Hannah Arendt arrived at a different conclusion, and perhaps a more sophisticated one. For her, power itself is not the problem. In fact, Arendt said something that sounds almost paradoxical. Genuine power never belongs to an individual. It belongs to a group acting together, moved by a shared purpose. When we speak of a leader who has power, we are using the word imprecisely. What that leader actually has is violence, the capacity to coerce, to force, to impose. And violence and power, for Arendt, are opposites. What corrupts them is not power. It is the isolation that comes with it. When a leader separates from the people who sustain them, when they stop being accountable, when they begin to believe that their position is a personal conquest rather than a collective delegation, they lose real power and come to depend solely on force. And that is where corruption takes hold, not as a consequence of power, but as a sign of its absence.
But there is yet another layer to this discussion, and it comes from contemporary psychology. Research over the past few decades shows that power alters the functioning of the brain in measurable and predictable ways. Studies conducted by psychologist Dasher Keltner revealed that people in positions of power tend to gradually lose the ability to take perspective, to see the world through the eyes of others. Empathy, quite literally, diminishes. The brain of someone who has exercised power long enough begins to function similarly to that of someone with a frontal lobe injury, more impulsive, less capable of inhibiting reactions, more self-centered. Keltner called this the paradox of power. The very qualities that lead us to positions of influence, empathy, listening, the ability to build consensus, are precisely the qualities that prolonged exercise of power tends to erode. We rise because of who we are, and the top changes us. This is not moral weakness, it is neurology, which does not mean it is inevitable, but it does mean that resisting this process requires an active, conscious, and constant effort that most people have never been trained to make.
And this is where Aristotle enters, with a perspective that contrasts with all the previous ones in an interesting way. For him, power is neither inherently corrupting nor inherently noble. It is an instrument. And like all instruments, its value depends entirely on who wields it and for what purpose. The question is not to avoid power, but to cultivate the character that allows it to be exercised well. It is arete, excellence of character, that determines whether power serves the community or devours those who hold it. For Aristotle, a virtuous leader is not someone who was never tempted. It is someone who was tempted, recognized the temptation for what it was, and chose differently. Not out of weakness, not out of fear of consequences, but because their inner constitution made the corrupt choice genuinely less appealing than the just one. This is rare. Aristotle knew that, but he insisted it was possible and that it was the only real answer to the problem of power.
So does power always corrupt? The honest answer is, it depends. It depends on the character of whoever exercises it. It depends on the structures surrounding it, on the presence or absence of accountability, of transparency, of real mechanisms of oversight. It depends on time. The longer power is exercised without resistance, the deeper the transformations it tends to produce. And it depends, above all, on something that no law, no institution, and no political system can guarantee on its own: the sincere willingness of those in power to remain answerable for it. Lord Acton was right that power tends toward corruption, but the most important word in his phrase is not corrupts, it is tends. Tendency is not destiny, and between tendency and destiny, there is a space where character lives, where conscience lives, where the courage to resist what power offers at its most seductive lives, the feeling that the rules were not made for you.
The true test of power is never what someone does when they are being watched. It is what they do when they are absolutely certain that they are not. And perhaps that is the most revealing question we can ask about anyone in a position of power, including ourselves, in the small positions of power that all of us occupy at some point in our lives. Because power is not only what presidents and kings exercise, it is what a manager exercises over an employee, what a parent exercises over a child, what any person exercises when they have the capacity to affect another person's life and can choose how to use that capacity. The question, in the end, was never really about power. It was always about who you decide to be when it is in your hands.
In the end, the idea that power corrupts is comforting because it allows us to blame power instead of people. But as we've seen, the reality is harder to accept. For Friedrich Nietzsche, power reveals. For Hannah Arendt, it disappears when it turns into isolation. For Aristotle, everything depends on character. And perhaps they're all right. Power is not just an external force, it is an internal test. And the real danger doesn't lie only with presidents or rulers, but in any situation where someone has the ability to affect another person's life. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Does power corrupt, or does it simply reveal who you've always been? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the ideas that shape power, truth, and human nature, you already know what to do. This is Logos and Law. See you in the next one.